Okay, welcome back. And while it's very disappointing that we were unable to hear from David L. Schindler today, nevertheless, it's an opportunity to have discussion and questions. Especially today, some of the presentations were a feast, but they also used up the time for questions. So here will be then the opportunity to do so. So the way it'll work here is Father Antonio and I will pose a couple of questions to prime the pump, get the juices going or something, and then it'll be time to to open it up. The participants will kind of get first shot, and then I'm sure we will also have a lot of time, plenty of time for everyone else. So with that, I think, why don't you start and ask your question?
So one of the things that I like to reflect again a little bit more is this understanding of freedom as made for truth, so with the secularity, right, of freedom is for truth, and truth includes freedom, which is most clearly seen in how Christ posits himself and relates to people, provoking them to respond to him. And I like to, maybe just to pose this question. Perhaps since, Professor Denin was the last one who spoke, then I'll ask the question, and then I don't know if I understood correctly, but it seems to me that one of, you mentioned at a certain point at the beginning of your wonderful presentation these two problems. The second one was, if I understood correctly, that Dignitatis Humanae seems to, there seems to be a tension or two ways of actions towards relations with others, right? On the one hand, it's insists on non-coercion, right? And then a few lines afterwards speaks about the mission of the church, more or less, in synthesis, right? So is this what you said? Is this tension? What do we make of this tension, right? My interest in here with this question again is to help us rethink a little bit more, what this religious freedom is in a positive sense, not so much as freedom from coercion, but freedom from the truth. So that would be my bullet. Yes.
Okay. I'll go ahead and ask my question. And then we'll go on. My question is also to the last panel, and it goes more directly to David C. Schindler, the Schindler that is with us today. And my question is, I really thoroughly enjoyed your presentation and found it extremely profound, and I found it very compelling as well. And I mean, I'm just wondering about its implications. I mean, if I followed your logic correctly, it leads to the idea that it really the common good would have to be essentially the church, the body of Christ, to put it in Catholic terms particularly, and that subsidiarity then would be, as you said, the kind of just autonomy of the political order, and that it would be, that it would be under the common good, which is actually religious. So there would be, a kind of secularity of the state understood in those terms, and I'd like for you to develop that a bit. I mean, in a certain sense, at least one way to understand your argument would be that in order to have freedom, or to have religious freedom, I mean, in a certain sense, as I pointed out in my paper, I think religious freedom invites a certain ambiguity because it suggests that religious freedom is only a subspecies of some other thing that is freedom, right? Religious freedom would only be possible in a confessional state. Is that, at which point a lot of people who would, all of the speakers here have been in some fashion or other critical of liberalism, either in principle or else at least in terms of its incarnation, as we could say, in the culture as we have it today. But a lot of people might begin to jump overboard, let's say, from the ship, if the logic of your paper and some of the other papers that have been presented is, what we have to have in order to be free as a confessional state, first of all. And then the other question would just be, is that really an interpretation of Dignitatis Humanae, or can it be reconciled with Dignitatis Humanae in the sense that there is the paragraph that suggests the possibility of the confessional state, but it seems to present it more as like a historical contingency, right, because of certain historical circumstances, rather than as the model, let's say. In which case, then, would the conclusion be, we're back to square one, and Dignitatis Humanae really is simply a capitulation to the development of liberalism. Okay. So, go ahead.
Sure. Father, thank you for the question, and I'm not sure I can do much more than in some ways repeat what I thought. What I suggested was a tension, as I suggested, that tension. Again, as I think Paulo Carrozza also observed about the, in some ways, once you get to the practical level, how this tension manifests itself on the ground. That tension, in which, on the one hand, the Dignitatis Humanae says that there should be no hint of coercion, right, by the state upon its citizenry in terms of their religious beliefs. And yet, to say that to what are increasingly liberal democracies around the world is in some ways to say, how can you, in some ways, not have a legal system that in some ways is ultimately going to coerce people, and yet that if there's supposed to be a special responsibility, as Dignitatis Humanae says, of religious people and religious believers to express the truth of their religion in the world, how can that not be in some ways manifest in the political system, in some form or another? Right, so what would it mean to have no hint of coercion? And so the example that I gave of laws against forbidding the sale of contraception, which once were the norm in the country, and were not necessarily seen as a sectarian law, would now, at least by this understanding, the way this has been interpreted, be regarded as a coercive use of state power to limit the personal and individual freedom of persons. So it seems to me that while the document in the Declaration articulates what seems like a reasonable statement, when you get to the facts of the ground, in some ways it can't be the case that laws can't reflect something true about human beings that will ultimately, because they're laws, be coercive. And what you could say now is that our legal system in many ways now reflects our prevailing definition of freedom, in which that which is deemed to be a legitimate law are laws that coerce us, as Stephen Macedo says, in order to make us free, in order to make us to want freedom. So that a law that forces the church to positively provide contraception is deemed to be a legitimate law, right? A coercive law that is legitimate, but a law that would forbid it is now seen as an illegitimate law because it would imply the hint of coercion. So it seems to me that this is an area where we need to think a lot more about as the church and as citizens of what it would be to express and to have a public expression of belief, of the ground of one's belief in the world, and yet avoid, in ways that don't seem to me to be entirely plausible, the hint of coercion. Right? It seemed to me that maybe what should have been said is the hint of illegitimate coercion. There's an adjective missing, perhaps. Right? But that a legal system ought and indeed fundamentally ultimately has to be an expression of the values and beliefs of that society. And in the absence of a value system that's grounded in the truth, what we have now is a value system that undermines the truth.
So the question about the confessional state, does the argument I was making imply that? And I mean, this is going to sound a little too paradoxical initially, but I mean, in a certain sense, the argument that I'm making implies that the only way to avoid a confessional state, in a certain sense, is if the state recognizes the authority of the Catholic Church. So, so I mean, the thing is, I'm all for the separation of church and state. I mean, the argument is that liberalism, in a way, it confuses that because why? Because the state is constantly making decisions about the fundamental meanings of things. And in that sense, it's usurping the authority of the church.
It's already confessional.
It's already, so in that sense, it's already confessional.
Invisibly so.
Yeah, for me, the key principle, and this has to be fleshed out, and I do a little bit at the end of the paper, but I've only begun to start thinking about these things, so I know that there's a lot. But the classic principle from Galasius that's considered sort of the culmination of the church's reflection on church-state relations, he says, for there are two by which the world is governed, the authority of priests and the royal power is the statement. And typically that's understood as church has power over one sphere and the state has power over another. But it seems to me it's significant that there are two different words being used there, auctoritas and potestas. And auctoritas, it means, there's an analogy, and that implies a radical differentiation of power. And I think a possible way of interpreting it is to say that the church is responsible, because the church has a responsibility for truth, to bear witness to the truth as such, in the way that the state doesn't, at least initially, that it shouldn't be the state that defines the meaning of freedom, person, marriage, etc. Conceivably, you can imagine a relationship in which the church has the authority to define what a person is, what marriage is, what freedom is, what religion is, and then the state receives those definitions, and the church does not regulate any of that, and so in that sense stays completely out of the temporal sphere, and it's not a temporal power, it's not a political power, it's not political. But the state receives those definitions and regulates them accordingly. And part of that, if you think about it, the Catholic Church, the question is what theology, having a theology is inevitable. The question is what theology actually has the best resources for religious pluralism? And Catholicism actually has a theology that opens up, that has a certain place for religious pluralism of a sort. It's not the kind that liberalism would recognize. But it seems to me that something like that then could be embodied in a state in radical separation from the church, but still receiving the authority of the church. And if it's not that authority, then it's going to be a theology of religious pluralism, which I want to argue, which I tried to argue in the paper, in fact eliminates all religions in the proper sense. And so it's hardly the case that liberalism has a greater theology of religious pluralism than Catholicism does.
Okay, so, yeah.
Front row, the whole front row.
Yeah, just start passing it down the front row.
Okay, you got to give me a couple.
Oh, I'm sorry. You need to stand up so that, I'm sorry. I should have had you guys.
You've been recorded.
Because you're.
All right. You got to give me a couple of minutes to work this out. Okay, so it seems like we're coming very close to saying that Dignitatis Humanae is fundamentally flawed and that maybe Ruffini and Ottaviani were right. No? Okay, well, let me work it out some more because we can't say that, right? But we're coming like real close. So in the Declaration of Independence, we talk about the free exercise of religion, whatever that is, and the disestablishment of religion. So it seems to me that if a liberal state is to have any legitimacy at all, and we're coming very close to saying that it has no legitimacy, then it has to be able, for the sake of law, to define what it will be understood as that which is being freely exercised and that which is not being established. And it seems to me that we have come very close to saying that it has no such right and that liberal polities are not legitimate. And so, like Dave, I wanted to ask you if it's possible to have a political body outside the church, or how would that work? And if it's not,
And you think it is possible?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure what it would be. Yes, I think it's possible, but it would have to be like circumscribed. Like the church is transnational. The Pope doesn't live in a country. And I think that the idea that the church is transnational is really important to how I understand Catholicism. And I understand myself to be a Catholic first. That's what I am. I belong to the church. But I'm also, inevitably, I belong to this political body. It's just my country.
You owe allegiance to a foreign potentate.
Well, that's what I spend my life studying. How Catholics tried to deal with people telling them that they had allegiance to a foreign potentate, and that's where the traditions of liberal Catholicism come from, and they're being totally trashed. And so I want to know what's left. And if Dignitatis Humanae has any validity, and if it does, in what does it consist? And what was Ottaviani and Ruffini right about? And what were they wrong about? That's my question.
Yeah, maybe Dave should have, well, was it along the same line here?
Yeah.
Okay, maybe advance the question then, okay. Go ahead. Glenn.
First of all, on an earlier comment, I think it's pretty much agreed that the word auctoritas in Roman law designates somebody who initiates policy, and the word potestas designates an office that implements policy. And I think there are pretty good circumstantial arguments that that's what Gelasius meant when he wrote that. That's not why I made the comment, but I think that's pretty clear. I want to follow up on something that you said, and that is, I think there really is a good case that this is not a very well-written document. I'm a medievalist, so I'm used to reading conciliar documents of the 7th and the 9th and so forth centuries, and just sort of saying in passing, well, this is probably not the church at its intellectual best. So I don't know why that's out of bounds in terms of...
That's sort of what's been implied.
Right, in terms of a 20th century document. So that, I mean, in my reading of it all along from the time it was written, I've assumed that that paragraph that does talk about the still legitimacy of confessional states somehow has to be fit with the other, and it's really very difficult to fit them together. But I've always assumed that it meant that, in some sense, that has to be the limit for the Catholic position here. In other words, there's a sort of normative status. It doesn't mean that we get it historically or that we even have to, try to, in a serious way, to implement it. But that in an ideal order, to talk that way is to talk about what leads to the eschaton. And so I guess I feel bad in a certain sense that hasn't been explored. That is, there's very little sense of the intellectual inferiority of our own times within the church, not just every place else. And so that's the point that I would want to make. I was on the way down there. No.
I'll make one comment before I give this back to David, which is, in defense of, in defense of the position that that David's not a wacko, which occasionally I find myself in this situation. But the argument, the substance of the argument that David was making, as I mentioned to him earlier, is historically verified in the fact that the first statement of a political theory that argues that the state is limited in its competence is Augustine's City of God, which is precisely premised upon the reality of the community, the transnational community, and the more fundamental belonging of all in principle to the church and the city of God. So that without that there would never have been any notion of a limited state. And so in a certain sense, the unlimited state is the norm outside of that dynamic.
Just briefly in response to Dr. Portier's concern, why do you take Dignitatis Humanae to be a liberal document? And why is a criticism of liberalism? So I'm speaking for myself, I'm perfectly happy with the final conciliar text.
Because I read Dignitatis Humanae as...
You need to have a microphone here.
There you go.
Go ahead, you can have at it now.
As a qualified acceptance. I read Dignitatis Humanae as a qualified critical acceptance of modern politics. And that seems to me to be close to liberalism as it's being described here. And so that seems to be a problem, an intellectual problem that's troubling my mind. However limited my mind might be. You know.
Okay, then, not directly in response, but where I would say Cardinals Ottaviani and Ruffini, the mistake was in their understanding of truth. And it's quite clear they didn't see a principled commitment to the truth required freedom and called for an understanding of the dignity of the person and therefore respect for the freedom of the person. So that's the novelty. So I don't see Dave's position or... Put that abstractly, maybe, but I'm not sure that's not what the question is. Modern.
Constitutionally established.
You need to. Yeah. Just hold on. Sorry.
I was just.
Could you please stand?
I was just helping to define the qualified acceptance of modern politics, and it seems to be clearly accepting the constitutionally guaranteed establishment of freedom of religion, which means really separation of church and state. Maybe there's some additional qualification I need to make there, but the section that talks about established religion, being kind of tolerated, that seems to be what Bill was understanding as his reading of the document. And when you move forward into other documents like Centissimus Annus, it seems to be pretty clear that that there's a further reaffirmation of that direction. So that seems to be quite contrary to what the main thrust of the speakers at the conference, the number of the speakers at the conference is that is not compatible with Catholicism. So, Bill. Thank you.
Okay. Do you want to say something, Nick? Michael, would you like to?
Yeah,
Please stand.
Who's arguing against the well, I won't be up long. Who's arguing against the constitutional separation of church and state? I see a constitutional separation of church and state entailed in exactly what. Dave apparently is the biggest theocrat among us, and I mean that in all affection.
And there's a constitutional separation of church and state in what you're talking about. So, I mean, who's arguing against that? Right, that would be the point.
Just historically, to kind of make that point, if you look at the Roman Empire prior to Christianity, I mean, you have a kind of pluralism, right? I mean, they make a pantheon so people can go kind of worship the god of their choice. But it's not a real pluralism because the state is in control of it, so that if your religion actually claims to be true, it doesn't get tolerated, right? So you don't have that. So then Augustine comes along and does what Marx told us that he does. And that distinction between church and state operates pretty nicely for a long time until you get to liberalism. And that's when you get a guy like Rousseau saying we can't stand these Catholics because they want to make a distinction between realms. I mean, that's what he doesn't like about Catholicism. It's not, he wants a monism. And so, I hear everybody talking about the separation of church and state here properly understood. What I think we're rejecting, or what I hear being rejected, is monism, which is what we have, which is what Rousseau wanted. It seems Hobbes wanted it, and I think Locke wanted it. So I don't think liberalism is a separation of church and state at all. I mean, that's at least the way I read it. So let's just be some historical stuff.
Can we pass it to Professor Bauer-Schmidt?
Thanks. This might take things in a slightly different direction, but I think it's been an undercurrent in a lot of our conversations. I have a friend who used to like to say, well, that's fine in practice, but how does it work out in theory? I've got to say that I think sometimes we don't respect the distinction between theory and practice. Of course, theory informs practice, and practice, forces us to revise theory and so forth and so on. But let me put it this way. Okay, so whenever it was, we had that bizarre storm 18 months ago, the derecho, that came through, and it knocked down my lesbian neighbor's tree, so it blocked our street. So my Orthodox Jewish neighbor got his chainsaw out, and along with my Catholic family and the cat lady down the street and a whole bunch of other different people who I'm pretty sure had different comprehensive doctrines, we cleared our street. We made a path so that we could drive down the street. And and it allowed us to go to church, and it allowed the Orthodox Jewish neighbors to go to the synagogue, and it probably allowed somebody to go down the street and buy pornography, right? On the way to church. On the way to church. It was a gift for the pastor. But the point is, here you have people with radically different conceptions of the common good who are able to band together to achieve a goal, right? Now, David, you made, I think, a really interesting distinction between, or not a distinction, but a point about the relationship of wholes and parts. And I have no issue with what you said. That seems exactly right and completely true to Thomas. But it seems to me that when you're dealing with questions of practical reason as opposed to speculative reason, the more important point is about proximate and ultimate ends. And it seems to me there's a certain important way in which acts are specified by the proximate end and not simply by the ultimate end. So it seems, now of course I'm talking about a very small scale event, a bunch of neighbors getting together, and clearing a tree off the street. And of course, you want to say, well, the state is something completely different. It's a much larger scale. It's got all sorts of other coercive powers and things like that. I guess my question is, practically speaking, how do we know where to draw the line? I mean, I don't think I hope nobody here would tell me that I can't band together with my neighbors to clear a tree off the street because we don't have a shared conception of the common good, right? I mean, clearly, the proximate end, and the technical know-how that, fortunately my Orthodox Jewish neighbor wears a yarmulke with a cowboy hat over it, that he could actually knew how to use the chainsaw without, chopping limbs off of people. So clearly we didn't need an overarching concept of the common good to do that. Now,
wasn't that the street?
What's that?
Sorry, isn't the street the overarching principle of the common good that precedes the
but that's not I mean, that's not, we would want to call that well, let me say an ultimate end. Okay, we didn't share an ultimate end, right? And it seems to me, at least the way that the term common good has been used here, right? And we shared a proximate end, but clearly clearing a street is for the sake of something else, so therefore it's by definition not an ultimate end, right? So the way we've been using common good here, it seems like we've been using it more or less in the sense of ultimate end, right? So it just seems to me empirically false that you need to share an ultimate end in order to do all sorts of common activities together. So this is sort of a general question for whoever wants to pick this up. We did share a proximate end, right? And we could not have coordinated our activities. I mean, if somebody's proximate end was clearing the street and the other person's proximate end was building a tree house, we wouldn't probably have not have gotten anywhere, right? What's that?
Because
You have to have a microphone.
I mean, I don't know much American stuff and all that, so I have to be, whatever. But limbs of a tree, but not limbs of a person, we joked. Why not? There's already ultimacy there. And secondly, and the main point I make is I think we're all understanding the word limitation incorrectly. The church is not, it's not limiting the state. It's enabling the state to be. Otherwise, the state becomes the church. It becomes a theocracy of an atheist persuasion, but it becomes a theocracy. It doesn't stop at the borders of North America. It goes right across the world, it's transnational, and so forth. You can't actually have a state. The church enables a state by giving a sense like limit. Limit like a kidney is limited, it's not a toe. Limit is not only one woman. Yeah? It's that there is a woman. It's enablement, not negative freedom. And that's the point where the church enables, because the crisis we're having politically, and I'm not very good at politics, so I should shut up, but is exactly that. There are no states anymore. There are no states. There are no communities. And that, cutting down the thing, that's purely ultimate. That's so full of teleology, it's so full of finality, you couldn't breathe without it. You wouldn't even be able to describe it without it. I am doing X rather than Y. You wouldn't do it. I go for cutting off the limbs of the humans. I go for that.
Connor, I just want to be clear about what you're saying. So you're saying that, in fact, we did share an ultimate end.
Yeah, you did.
And we would not have been able to do anything without sharing an ultimate end.
You wouldn't have noticed.
Okay, so what ultimate end did we share?
Your humanity. The dignity of your humanity. Because you cut off the tree's limbs, but not the neighbour's. So, and then you had respect for your neighbour. What's a neighbour? Love your neighbour as yourself. So here we have already the analogy going, which is ontology and metaphysics and so forth. I don't think the actual scenario works without the ultimate already mediated through it. I didn't think it took place. And actually, what was Hurricane Sandy? What is a hurricane? I mean, what does that mean? And how is it destroyed? That's nominal. Unless there's something really happening to families, something really happening to people. And I actually think, I mean, Walker will have to help me with this, because my Latin is crap now, but you can almost reverse these terms. It could be human, therefore dignity. Not simply the human is, it's upside around. It enables you to naturalize nature. So you can actually go, let's just cut the limbs off the tree rather than off the person.
Sorry, Connor, I think we have such deep philosophical disagreements that I now believe in incommensurability.
I just have one question for Fritz, which is, what is the cash value of what you're saying? I mean, okay, so you've made the point that we can, in fact, work for proximate ends and not necessarily have before our eyes some great, huge ultimate end. That's all well and good if a society shares some overarching ultimate end, say back in the days of pan-Protestantism in this country. But as soon as you get some sort of civil religion breakdown, so we do have incommensurate positions, then you're not just left with proximate ends. What do you do when the question of dismembering fetuses comes up, for example?
I mean, I think that you're belittling some of the differences that are going on in our society.
One point. Believing in principality, is that not believing?
Yeah.
I will try to express myself in English, but excuse me if I'm not very, very clear. To my opinion, 30 or 40 years ago, when we talk about religious freedom, and we saw exactly what Professor Antonio Lopez expressed, the problem between the right and the truth, freedom and truth. But at that time, there were no huge differences between society and civil society and the church towards the referring, as regards the natural law. The problem now has changed. It has changed because natural law has not the same meaning, and the natural law, we are only in the church, in the Catholic Church, to defend this concept. Because nature today is disqualified by civil society. So my question would be, with a specialist like you are in this field, today we need maybe to have a tertium quid, to have the nature, the concept of nature, to mediate between freedom and rights, and human rights. If we don't, we are condemned to discuss only on the juridical and law field. It's my opinion. And I would like to illustrate this question, it's only a question, with the fact that I don't understand, and nobody of us could understand, how the gay ideology succeeded in 25 years to present their ideology like a religious truth to which all politicians adhere, agree with. Why is there unanimity in accepting their way to ask the question of the homosexual behavior and homosexual institution, marriage and so? And why? It's because nobody restrained these false religious freedom. You understand what I mean, no? The problem, to my opinion, is that we have to ask ourselves how it was possible for such a minority. Would you imagine in Europe when there were the debates in Britain and in France about, we discovered that it concerned less than 0.2% of the population. How is it possible that they succeed to captivate the attention of the public debate, while the church, which is normally superior, from very short, but superior to 0.2%, never succeed in establishing his conviction and make his conviction accepted in a civil society. There is a question here, There's a question of a status of truth, and the question also of the pastoral of the church, the way we have to transmit, the way also lay people, you say, Professor, exactly at the beginning, that every Catholic, where there is a Catholic, there is a doctrine, a different doctrine, more or less. So why the gay ideology, they have 2 or 3 assertions, they present that as a whole, and all society follow, all the politicians follow that. So my opinion is that we have to deepen in this way to articulate a new way of relationship between nature, natural law, to save natural law, and to mediate between right and freedom. Freedom and truth. Excuse me. Thank you. I don't know if it makes sense.
Yeah, and it's a great question. I mean, we're talking about 0.2% versus like 8 or 9% practicing in France. I mean, I don't know what the figure is. Five. Still, yeah. And I think it is fascinating. I mean, it's the same thing here in the United States, obviously. And I mean, I think it points out one of the. I mean, there's religious freedom and there's religious freedom, right? I mean. There's the dark side to, you might say, or the way that the phrase or the idea, the concept, the way the phrase has been conceptualized in a certain sense in our culture is, in fact, I mean, it was Professor Deneen that called attention to words and how the meanings have been changed, and perhaps it's a task to reclaim something like freedom. And religious freedom, in a certain sense, has become a kind of a limiting concept in a certain way, so that religious freedom only becomes one flavor within a whole set of other kinds of freedoms. And as I was trying to point out in my paper, by the very nature of it, it's then treated as having a kind of a non-rational content, whereas the other ones have a rational content that's easily expressed. So I think it's easily expressed according to the underlying type of public rationality that's available. So therefore, it always loses, and its weight grows smaller and smaller. So in that sense, religious freedom is dangerous, right? As a concept within our culture, within a liberal culture, I think the answer to your question, therefore, is that even though we're talking about a very small segment of the population, nevertheless, the kinds of arguments that are available to them carry disproportionate weight. And you're right about there's no concept of nature that's allowed. That becomes part of the narrowing of religious freedom. Even though Catholics wouldn't tend to think of it along those lines, nevertheless, the culture does. So that, I mean, what's remarkable, I think, for example, in just reading Rawls, oftentimes the model or the example used will be, of a comprehensive doctrine, will be religious. But he means much more completely just philosophy. What's not allowed is philosophy. Or let's say, only a certain kind of philosophy will be allowed. I mean, it's significant that Rawls himself, as I understand it, is the most quoted philosopher by the U.S. Supreme Court. I think it's true that other philosophers who have had a lot to say about political philosophy, let's say, even Kant or Aristotle or Plato, would be seen as injecting a particularistic view of things. Why is it that Rawls's philosophy is seen not as injecting some particularistic viewpoint, but simply, the general and sort of order of things? I mean, it seems to me that's significant right there. So it's not just that religious dialogue is no longer public form of public rationality. Philosophy itself is no longer a part of public rationality. So oftentimes you hear appeals, well, this is available to reason. Well, it doesn't matter. Reason is not available for public. Public reason is not about reason. I guess that's one way of putting it. Yeah. So, yeah. Dr. Walker. Intoxicated by all this great.
No, it's really interesting to me to observe how much disagreement there is among us under the surface, and then it sort of emerges every once in a while at certain flashpoints. That's really interesting. I just think
just a couple of areas that seem to be in need of further reflection. I mean, one is the distinction between liberal institutions and liberal ideology. Dr. Schindler Sr. might have talked about that had he been here. I mean, some people think it's untenable, and some people think that it can be used to express a sort of a Catholic sense that, look, the political common good is, not the only one, and so forth. It's one common good, analogously related to others, and so forth. Also, what it means to make a distinction, and that's another issue that comes up over and over again, what it means to distinguish two things. And then a third area that's a related issue is sort of just people's sense of how bad things are, you know. And it's actually related to the first two issues, right? I mean, some people think, I mean, everybody agrees that we're in a bad state. Everybody agrees that there's a liberal ideology that's objectionable for sort of reasons that it's almost getting tiring to kind of repeat, you know. But yeah, almost right. I mean, conference isn't over yet. And that's just really interesting that this thing of a disagreement about, right, everybody agrees about that, but then the question is, what's really wrong? Where does the problem start? What does it have to do with, if anything, the system that we have? Why is it that spontaneously everybody gets nervous when certain boundaries are approached? Well, confessional state can't have that, and so on and so forth. I mean, there's just a lot of, there's a lot of confusion, I think, in my own mind too, but there's really a lot of confusion just surrounding not only the question of religious liberty, but all of the kinds of other questions that go into figuring out what it means to be Catholic in the modern world. And anyway, I just simply wanted to record that there were several issues that were kind of under the surface of the last couple of days. Other allied ones as well, but those were three that I think are kind of significant. Thanks.
Just to respond to Bishop Lafitte briefly, I agree that the central and crucial and necessary mediating term is nature, and by implication, natural law. And that's also the source of the most profound difficulty, because liberal freedom, what we all think freedom is, the kind of freedom which is now, in a sense, absolute, is predicated not just in the political sphere, but even in a certain sense prior to the invention of liberal politics, precisely on, in a certain sense, denying nature, eliminating form, eliminating finality, converting nature itself into art, that is to say, accidental aggregations of matter brought about by force, the knowledge of which is to be able to exercise that force in order to be able to control, either in the form of prediction or manipulation or successful replicable results. So that, and I think it's one of the reasons why natural law arguments are really unintelligible, because, as I tried to ask in my paper, what can natural law be when nature itself is just a set of cold empirical facts that we can only know, in a sense, by getting command over? Which means then that the problem with liberalism and the problem with overcoming liberalism and the problem of unthinking this is not just a political problem. It's not just a problem of political arrangement. It's a problem of what we take reality to be, what we take the knowledge of reality to be, because our dominant modes of knowing the world are predicated on precisely the same ontology. There's no room for being to show itself as what it is. Which is why this connection then between liberal society and technological society all of what that means is so profoundly important and so extraordinarily difficult, and why, well, I'll just leave it there. Yes, I think that's true, but how we get there from here may take another 500 years. The 500 years that it's taken us to arrive at this point. The implications in the meantime are rather scary. Mark, did you want this, or just go back? I don't know where this goes.
I'm going to shift.
I would just like to add on to this question of nature and the bishop's comments and yours. My colleague Rodney Hauser wrote something rather, I think, profound last week, and it piggybacks on something that you just said, Dave, that I think is extremely important, which is that it's not only natural law in its more religious guise, which isn't allowed into the public square anymore. It's any argument at all. What we're not allowed to present is even an argument. I know from teaching students with regard to homosexuality or whatever, they resent not just the religiosity of my position, they resent the very effort to construct an argument against the position, which raises a very interesting question about what's really going on here. It really is a crisis of truth, a crisis of reason, and in some ways, to go back to Bill's point as well about Dignitatis Humanae, and so my attitude towards Dignitatis Humanae is that it's quaint and it's out of date. Within its time, it was, I think, a limited valorization of a certain concept of the separation of church and state, but the council presumed the continuing relevance of natural law, reason as a mediating language within the public square, and I think that is no longer possible to us. In that sense, Dignitatis Humanae, I think, was fine, but it has now been surpassed by a graver crisis that we know of, a crisis of reason itself, a crisis of, and that's why I thought it was a very profound thing that you just said about we're not even allowed philosophically to present an argument. I think maybe others could comment on that, but I think that's really important. Ron, did you wrote about this? Anyway.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is actually worth saying. I mean,
could you stand up?
Yeah. Do I have to? I mean,
well, you have to turn in that direction.
No, look, I'm so tired. I shouldn't even be speaking. This is really stupid. It's really stupid. But no, I mean, the thing is, I just sort of said sort of flippantly to Bill, I mean, is it an infallible document? And he said, no. Although you actually bleeped yourself. I mean, that was good. So he just said no because it's from an ecumenical council. But that sort of raises a really interesting question. I mean, it seems implausible to say that every sentence or something like that was even intended to be that. So the question really is, what's the heart of the document? What are they most fundamentally trying to do? Because it seems like that's the way that we always used to read Gaudium et Spes here, right? Ratzinger, but way back 40 years ago, said, look, there's a tension in this document. Where's the heart of it? What is the heart of the document? And then, in light of that heart, you read the other stuff, and you never reject it. I mean, you can't, because it comes from an ecumenical council, right? No, you can't reject it. But you have to. But then you have to read it in light of. You have to read it as an attempt to articulate something from that heart that may, at the level of formulation. Well, this is the question, and that's why I thought it would be worth saying this, because at the end of our little exchange, you said, we haven't really touched that question much, and in fact, you're right. I mean, I think that's a really fundamental question. I mean, my own hunch is that it has something to do with, it has something to do with anthropology. So there would be the question of Gaudium et Spes 22 and all of that stuff that has been talked about a lot here. But then there would be a question also about this idea of reading the signs of the times, which sounds quaint, but actually that's a statement from the gospel. And it means trying to understand what the meaning of new events is in light of a providential economy. And I mean, I don't mean, discerning some sort of meaning of history or something like that in the objectionable sense. But I mean, that is a really interesting question. What is the significance of these events in the light of a providential economy? And I think really that question needs to be thought of in terms of providence and evil, and the providential significance, I'm just repeating something I said earlier, of the fallibility of man. And it seems to me in that light, you could actually develop something like a right to immunity from coercion, for example, on appropriately non-liberal terms, right? And then we could debate about, that. Because the point would be, there's something about, but this is really the thing, it's just an intuition, and it would be interesting to kind of think it through more carefully. What is the significance of God allowing people to make mistakes? Is that, what's he doing? Is he being stupid? Or is he just kind of biding his time, and then he's just going to nail people at the, or what, right? No, and then it, yeah, right. So that's the question is, that's the question is the significance of fallibility, which the political authority, precisely on the terms that I think, we just throw that in, that DCS was saying, was laying out, would require the state or the political authority to take a kind of loving account of, so to speak. So that would be, I think, a way of retrieving all of this stuff. I mean, every single bit of it, but in terms of an actual center, rather than just sort of, our own attempt to kind of patch things together from bits and pieces of different traditions,
Yeah, if I can have a microphone and you don't. No, I just wanted to follow up a little bit with the last thing you mentioned, because I don't have in what I'm going to say any claim on saying this is the point, but I'm going to make a point, I think, but it came very clearly in your presentation, Dr. Hill. To me, one of the very interesting things of the document is the second part, in which it presents how Christ addresses the people, right? Now you could say that's perhaps not complete, because the emphasis in there is how Christ lets man respond to him, right? So in a sense, to me, one of the values of these documents that we still need to reconsider, not being afraid with the fallibility, more than a principle of reality, right? Is exactly this, that truth asks the person to respond. Truth wants to be welcomed and embraced, and you cannot see it until that is done, right? So, in a sense, the letting of one's own conscience to decide, right? It's not just Christ leaving you there on the corner and then think about it, and then once you made up your mind, come back and tell me what you think, right? So, but in a sense, it's a real provocation. So in a sense, this issue of what is opened up is that the freedom is religious, in a sense that it has to respond to the truth that asks to be received for what it is in its entirety, right? And then in here, since to me what you said this morning, that was going to be my question to you, not to extend your, I guess, your third quarter, right? Yeah. Right, which is the principle of, that there is, one can say no, there is evil, right? And then what this enables, right, is ultimately a rediscovery of what the unity between man and God is all about. No, there's a gratuity to this that without the possibility of evil, we could have not seen, right? We can say this after the fact, of course, right? So, so this. I guess my task is not that of thinking alternative political systems, right? But what I think is crucial that is also to realize that how we got here is by people who have been formed, right, within a Christian mentality, right. So in a sense, you have to trust that that the person. You have the person and God, right? That in the dialogue in history, one grows into the truth, right? And then when one is asked the task to run a state or a society, he does that informed not by a common mentality that seeks preservation of power, right? But one mentality that is informed by the truth, right? So I guess I start.
When you, I mean, it seems to me that, you know, precisely a kind of proper confession of faith in another point of the council that's really important is the overcoming of limited predestination, which it seems to me theologically would imply that on the cross, the most radical act of judgment is also the most radical act of mercy. That if we really believed that, then in a certain sense, there would be a right ordering of principles in our own minds in order to tackle the issue. What's the issue? The issue is there are all these signs of the times that the church has realized that it can't simply, or at least it shouldn't, simply ignore as if it just falls outside of God's providential economy. On the other hand, you know, I mean, Gaudium et Spes says that. I mean, light and darkness, you know, and you know, all of the, I mean, Benedict and John Paul II say the same thing. And it's really tempting to think, okay, well, let's kind of, you know, separate the light from the darkness using some sort of partial account of things. You know, I like the new natural law, or I like the old natural law, or I'm into this, or I'm into that. And so we sort of try to use that as a lever to kind of separate the light from the darkness. And at least I know myself, whenever I try to do that, it always feels extremely sort of, I mean, bordering on ideological, you know, because you're always leaving something out. You're always, you know. But the point is, precisely when you start from what is the heart of the council, then you have a principle that enables you to do both simultaneously. I mean, not because you're anything, but because you're a follower of Christ, who is everything, and so you can absolutely judge, you can absolutely condemn all of the darkness all the way down, and you can also save everything that deserves to be saved. And that's the point, is that there are all these, I think the council also talked about aspirations. I think that's a really helpful concept. What are these aspirations? But again, the point is, in that radical, comprehensive context, which is the only one, really, and I think that's actually what Connor was trying to say, but it wasn't dumb what he was saying, that it's only if you think out of that most radical, comprehensive context that you can actually think even philosophically, which means seeing and thinking about the whole, you know, reality, reason as openness to reality and the totality of its factors, as Don Giussani would say. That's the point, it seems to me. So it's not a question of, oh, we're denying, you know, Dignitatis Humanae or something. The point is we're trying to carry through what it means to reclaim all of these aspirations from the inside in the light of this comprehensive context of judgment and mercy that enables you to actually see the whole for the first time, almost.
Yeah, we could, maybe at this point, we could open up for a variety of people who haven't had a
Can I
chance.
just say one quick word? To
Okay,
that?
if it's quick. Yeah.
It's to Walker Hamby and the bishop earlier. The problem with, back to Fritz's point, the ultimate and proximate ultimate, the state of the play now, which I have to deal with all the time, scientists, nihilists, so forth, is that the proximate has become the ultimate. Yeah? The proximate has become the ultimate. I'll give you a really, really quick example of this. We talk about, Walker was talking about marriage and contraception, and Hamby was talking about nature being this sort of, Promethean thing that I would just manipulate and control. There are two philosophers of mind, some of the foremost in the world, two of the foremost in the world, and they're married, and they're Canadians, so go figure. Patricia and Paul Churchland. Have you ever heard of them? And they both believe in a limited materialism. There is no such thing as the mind. Here comes the proximate, absorbing the ultimate. They don't believe that humans exist. Yet they married. I don't know who was there at the wedding saying, I do. And I don't know how they consummated their marriage, but apparently they did because they're married. That is the state of play. When we talk about these other things, we have to go from that fundamental level where the proximate is swallowing up and rendering impossible the ultimate.
Maybe we could open this up to people who've not had an opportunity to speak or ask questions so far.
I'm very interested that you got to this point about this question about the confessional state, because right from the very beginning I was thinking that same point, and that's something I learned from Father Lopez's, one of his classes. Hello. I'll have to speak at them? All right, so I'm talking to you anyway. The whole question of who gets to decide what marriage is, what's the definition of marriage, and when Tametsi and how that all came out in the canon law and clandestine marriage and all that stuff. And the question came up in that class, isn't this just like a power grab from the church to be able to discern things? And Father Lopez, he may not remember, but he said, yeah, what's the matter with that?
I don't recall.
But the idea that the church has a function, it understands itself, even in those documents, even that far back, it has a function of assisting the state in defining these things, so that the state can be a state, as we were saying before. But that was before pluralism and all that stuff. But then at the very beginning, Cardinal Scola's, if I understood him, his proposal, or he was speaking about how do we have religious freedom and a legitimate pluralism and conversation, especially when we're talking about all these different religious traditions and things. And it occurred to me that he was kind of saying something similar, that there does need to be a confessional state, but not necessarily one that confesses, that makes an act of faith to the Catholic Church, right? But one that makes explicit its anthropological claims, that man is, by his nature, to bring in these terms, nature again, a being that seeks the transcendent, that seeks the truth, and that has a duty to do so, and that the state, therefore, has functions in that. And if that kind of enters into the constitutional understanding of how the state runs, so it's receiving that truth from the church but it can articulate that same truth from different religious traditions, that it begins with man rather than a conception of man, rather than a particular theological tradition or something. Although you can't really escape the tradition, but it transforms everything from the inside out, while still leaving open the fruitful conversation among different religious traditions and so forth. So that's So I kind of think that you said you were surprised that you got to that point, and I kind of thought that's where we were going from the beginning. And then secondly, just as on the matter of practical matters, I find this like maybe, and I don't know if this is true, if this is what you perceive or not, but perhaps like a half step in that direction is already starting to happen in these personhood amendments at the state level, the constitutional amendment defining person beginning at conception, kind of as a way of dealing with the pro-life issues. I mean, it seems to me the argument against those proposals isn't so much that they're not true. The arguments against them is that, well, if we do that, it doesn't only get rid of contraception, it also, I mean, abortion, but it also gets rid of contraception, fetal fertilization, and all these things. And, you know, in Mississippi, that got a lot of traction, those amendments. But, you know, if something like that happens, you're already, like, you're one step in the direction of what I think you're saying. You're making a truth claim about the nature of the person that transforms the whole political structure in a kind of a fundamental way, but one that can still, I mean, it's not liberal anymore, but still be democratic and still fit, you know, maybe in the direction of kind of the tradition that we had, you know. So I see an opening there. I don't know how much of an opening that is. Maybe that's my question. Is that a legitimate opening, you think, or you know, are we doomed to just kind of having to raise the whole thing and begin over? You know, do we need to have a second American Revolution kind of thing? And, you know, so anyway, these are my two comments. But you know, I thought that if I understood him, Cardinal Scola's suggestion was along those lines. So.
Mr. McGinley.
If I understand, my name is Stephen McGinley, for the professors who might not know me and everyone else here. If I understand Bishop Lafitte's need, his desire as natural law and nature as being the mediator of truth and freedom, with Dr. Hanby's, the several classes that I had with him, if I understood what he was trying to get across is the confusion of nature and techne, etc. It seems to me that this fits very interestingly with Professor Bauerschmidt's example, insofar as natural law implies an ultimate end, at least if I understand Thomas properly, because natural law is situated within the context of its relation to divine law, etc. So it automatically implies the ultimate end of man. So that the ultimate end that your compadres shared was the very fact of your humanity being ordered to God from the beginning. And not just that, but being ordered to God in Christ from the beginning. So that every proximate end, and this, I don't know, perhaps this is not actually proper, but I think I understood this from Dr. Crawford's classes, would be that every proximate end, every human act bears in itself a statement about the ultimacy of man, a statement about what's ultimate as such. And if that's the case, then even the cutting down, the chopping up of a tree, if insofar as it's a human act, bears in itself the meaning of human agency, which is to say, is ordered to God in Christ through the Eucharist, through the bread and wine offered up, to be totally transformed. Now, that is just a comment. My question that I want to bring up is more ecclesiological. Professor Portier was talking about Dignitatis Humanae, and what is our conception? Are we accepting it, rejecting it, etc.? It seems important to me when we talk he was critiquing or questioning Dr. Schindler's paper and said, is the state outside the church in their mutual relation? I mean, he didn't say in their mutual relation, he just said outside. Right. It seems to me that what's essential there is, what do we mean by outside? Yes, but what do we mean by secularity? It seems to me that insofar as the church is the expert in humanity, she's the expert in humanity because Christ is totally human and totally divine. And that Christ reveals the fullness of what it means to be man. And so he reveals the fullness of what it means to be secular. And if that's the case, then that which is outside, in that which is proper to man, is revealed in Christ's hypostatic union. And that has to be taken up analogous, or however, I mean, I would have to think much more about this than I have time for, but you guys, it's your job to. So, but thinking about outside in terms of, more in terms of, because we're talking about the state and the church, more in terms of the hypostatic union, which itself needs to be seen in light of the circumcision of the Trinity, it would seem to me. But, so, perhaps.
Here, why don't you take this here?
Just real quick, what I mean by outside is the integrity of the state, like as a body, not necessarily outside as a metaphor, but the secularity of the state implies that there's some natural integrity to the existence of a state.
Right, but is that, I mean, the thing would be, the integrity, it seems to me, has to be seen precisely in light of the Council of Chalcedon. That Christ was the consummate citizen.
That would be a theos gumenon, comment on secularity.
So I think we're getting to the end, so this will have to be our last question.
Someone's phoning in a question. So I have a comment and a question, which might be a little unsophisticated or maybe simple and maybe radical or sound radical, but one thing that seems to me to be missing, and I thought of this with Bishop Lafitte's comment of the homosexual minority and how far they've gone, which is in a way impressive, is Ratzinger's comment as a cardinal about where the church was going, that it was getting smaller, and the importance of the role of creative minorities. And in a way, one of the characteristics of the homosexual agenda is an almost apostolic zeal to convert and win over even those who don't subscribe to the practice in a way. And one thing that seems to me to be missing, and maybe an outlet or a response to this kind of dilemma we're in, which I think Dr. Schindler rightly crystallized before us, how the relationship of a church and state is an apostolic dimension there that really questions us rather than, I agree with Father Lopez, it's not necessarily a technical or a political solution, but what Dignitatis Humanae requires, in a sense, is people who seek the truth. And I think that is in the body of Vatican II, in the sense of the other documents calling the laity to evangelize. And I think that that's perhaps, and this comes to the question, is I wonder why we haven't talked so much about this apostolic dimension. And I think about myself and even the context here in the US, if perhaps we don't understand that, in a way, and rightly understood, as a Catholic, I have the duty to evangelize. And it sounds awful in a way, like I need to go and convert people. Yeah, that's what it means, rightly understood. And I wonder if we really believe that we are called to go out. And that would, in a way, make that image, I think is beautiful, of cutting the tree a little different, because that relationship with the rabbi and the lesbian might have been different, where the ultimate end is really to proclaim Christ, and it might not have gone very well in the sense that the tree got cut, but you might have an uncomfortable conversation there. But perhaps in order to achieve Dr. Schindler's state, we might have to forego some of the things we think are beautiful of a happy coexistence in order to get to a higher end. So I wonder why this apostolic dimension is missing, if that's the case and my assumptions are right.
All right, I think with that, we have to draw the conference to a close. We have we have like 2 minutes for some important announcements, just like at the end of Mass, you know.